Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar presented by the Brain Injury Association of America. Today's topic is domestic violence and brain injury for survivors and caregivers. This is a topic that we're all very passionate about, and I know our presenters are as well. I've had the honor of hearing them present in the past, and I think you'll all be really impressed with what they have to share. I hope that during this webinar that you get to learn new information and, more importantly, learn about resources and support that is available in nationwide and or in your area. Today's attendees are all muted, but if you have a question, please type it into the Zoom Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and our presenters will answer the question as best as they can throughout the webinar. There is a chat feature that's also enabled if you want to share information with other attendees, but please use the Q&A box to submit your questions for the speakers. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the BIA website by next week. And with that, I'm pleased to welcome our presenters, Rachel Ramirez, Lauren Hawley, Heather Wild. They will each tell you a little bit more about themselves during their presentation, but as I mentioned before, each are quite impressive people.
Well, good afternoon, probably. Some of us, maybe it is a different time where you are. Good morning, good afternoon. I don't know if it's evening anywhere, but we are very, very excited that you joined us. If for those of you who don't mind, if you wouldn't mind, if people want to put like their names and where they're from or where they live in the chat, if you are here as a part of your work, kind of what that piece is, please feel free. I always think it's cool to see all the different spaces and places that you can, for us to all connect and see where everybody's from. Just to let you know, as far as just a couple of details, as far as how the chat works, you might see it if you click on the chat wherever that is on your screen. I think the default, it says it goes to, there's a little blue box above where you type your messages. It says host and panelists. But you can move that. You can check everyone if you want everyone to see what you're sharing in the chat. And if you're looking for the Q&A box, if you have a question and it does not kind of show up, I have a little bubble that says more, so you can always put questions in there. But like I said, feel free to just kind of introduce yourself in the chat if you would like. And I just wanted to, first of all, thank you all to every single one of you for taking time out of your day to attend this webinar as we're going to be talking about domestic violence and brain injury for survivors and caregivers. We are very excited about our continuing and evolving partnership we have with the Brain Injury Association of Ohio, and very excited to not to have the opportunity to share about some of the evolving work that we're doing here in Ohio, and kind of what this has looked like, and what is continuing to move forward. My name is Rachel Ramirez. We're going to start by introducing ourselves, talking a little bit about our organizations and our own backgrounds. I am from the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, which is the statewide coalition on domestic violence. I am assuming that there are people from all over the place. But one of the things to know about domestic violence services is every state in the nation, with the exception of, I think Oklahoma currently does not have a domestic violence coalition, has a domestic violence coalition. In about half of our states across the country, oh, I'm starting to see things in the chat. Great. Half of our states across the country have a domestic violence coalition and a sexual assault coalition. That is one coalition. That is an organization that is one organization. About half of the states, like in Ohio, have a domestic violence coalition and a sexual assault coalition, that they're separate organizations. So one of the things that we're really excited about today is to be sharing with you some of the information about just domestic violence services and what we do and how they work. We work with, in Ohio, we work with our local domestic violence programs, every coalition across the country. One of our main membership is made up of direct domestic violence service providers. So individuals who work in shelter organizations. We also have non-residential organizations. I think something that is always really important for me to tell people about this work is that there's a lot of people who think that domestic violence organizations are only shelters, and that could not be further from the truth. I will tell you just about in our organization, we have 76 programs that sheltered about 9,700 individuals, including 3,800 children over the past year. But we provided services to over 120,000 individuals. So that's one of the very first things I want all of you to know is that domestic violence services are much more broader and much wider than only a shelter. You can find domestic violence services, but it's usually pretty easy if you go into Google or whatever your favorite web browser is and put your city in a domestic violence program. There should be your domestic violence program that comes up. Virtually every domestic violence program has a 24-hour hotline, anonymous hotline, which you can contact pretty much around the clock. Many of our organizations have web chat or text messaging organization capabilities, and they are free. There are no charges, there are no services, there are no fees involved with those organizations. So just wanted to share just a little bit about, as we said, we provide what we do is we provide domestic violence program support, supportive services for survivors. We work with public policy and advocacy. So we do a lot of work around the training and program support and all of that with our 76 domestic violence programs. And actually, our group does a lot of work with other organizations nationally around this new issue of domestic violence and brain injury. Now I'm going to pass this over to my friend Heather at the Forensic Nursing Network to talk a little bit about her background and her organization.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Rachel. My name is Heather Wild. I am the Director of Education with the Forensic Nursing Network. In brief, I have been a nurse 30 years now, and I did intensive care for the majority of my early nursing careers when I was young and could do all that easier. And then about 10 years ago, I truly learned about forensic nursing. I didn't know a whole lot about it. And the more I learned, the more I wanted to be involved, and I became a forensic nurse examiner. I do still practice as a forensic nurse and see patients and things like that, but currently I do have the full-time position as the director of education. It's very important to me to go around the state. As you can see, our mission is really to improve the healthcare response to violence, and we do a lot of that at FNN through education. Things like this, educating around the state. We really try to bring the multidisciplinary team together. We know that when we have law enforcement and advocates and prosecutors and nurses in one room, we can talk and we can improve things together. The other thing we do is we continue to mentor forensic nurses. We help train nurses to become forensic nurses in Ohio, and we continue to mentor them whenever they need anything or have any questions. We're truly here for them to help them grow as forensic nurses. We love to network across Ohio and build collaborations like we have now with ODVN and BIOH and many other organizations throughout Ohio. And as I mentioned, education is really one of the key points that we do at FNN. I'm going to tell you a little bit later more about what I do specifically as a forensic nurse and how this relates to domestic violence and brain injury. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to Lauren.
Thanks so much, Heather. So my name's Lauren Hawley, and I'm the Executive Director of the Brain Injury Association of Ohio. We are one of the many affiliates of the Brain Injury Association of America scattered across the country. We have been in existence now for over 40 years. I came on board almost 5 years ago. I've worked in healthcare social services for over 25 years now. And had kind of worked across the continuum, but I had a family member that sustained 2 traumatic brain injuries and was appointed to be that person's health advocate as she navigated life after those brain injuries. And what I found was that there were so many gaps in care, that navigation was very challenging, even having an advocate. And so when this opportunity came available, I jumped at the opportunity to combine my personal passion of making those connections stronger for survivors and easier for people to navigate with my professional background. And at the Brain Injury Association of Ohio, we provide programs and services to the entire state, really with the mission of helping survivors and caregivers create better futures after injury. And so we do that through a variety of services and programs. We offer resource navigation through our helpline and neuro resource facilitation, which I'll touch on a little bit later. We provide education not only to the community, to those that have been directly impacted by brain injury, as well as professionals throughout the year. We do a lot of advocacy, both on the individual level to help people advocate for themselves, as well as on the statewide level, looking to improve policies in the state of Ohio for those that have been impacted by brain injury as well. And we also work in collaboration, much like this collaboration we're going to talk about today, with partners across the state to try to improve the level of services available to Ohioans after injury, as well as to reduce the silos of care that exist. And none of our programs and services cost anything for those that participate in our programs. And we also have no parameters of service, meaning that we will serve folks no matter how they obtained their brain injury, whether they've had an official diagnosis or not. And we will connect them to the right services to help get them moving forward on their rehabilitation journey. And I'll send it back to Rachel.
All right, thank you. So that's a little bit about us, and I'm going to, and also we have, I don't know, Casey, if I know Casey is kind of in the background. Casey, if you just want to say hi real quick, if you're in a position where you can. Casey works with me at ODVN and is the one keeping charge of the chat and answering the questions. So Casey, I can't see you, but
Yep, I'm here. Hi, everyone. My name's Casey. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Health and Disability Project Coordinator at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. Yep, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A so I can respond. Or if you'd like to send me a message directly, feel free to do so. I hope you have that capability. But anyway, we're so glad you're here with us today and hope you can walk away with some tools and resources.
great. Thank you, Casey. So just a little bit about the collaboration that has brought us together. We are three, I think that I call us small but mighty, and I don't know if any of you have ever been a part of collaborations. Sometimes I think smaller collaborations often can get a lot of stuff done because there's less of us, there's less people when we think about scheduling. But the Ohio Cost of Violence Collaboration, COST is an acronym for the Collaboration on Strangulation and Traumatic Brain Injury Survivorship. So this is a group of our three organizations that was established in 2020. So we have been meeting weekly since 2020. We actually, for many of you, taking you back in time, we applied for this grant in February of 2020. Then we had this thing called COVID that happened in March of 2020. So had to do a lot of kind of refiguring and reimagining what we would be doing together in our new COVID world. But this was really a group that was brought together, funded by the Office on Violence Against Women, really focusing on how to build capacity to address some of these issues, this whole issue of domestic violence and sexual violence, of traumatic brain injury and strangulation, of the healthcare issues that domestic violence survivors and the healthcare services that domestic violence survivors need. So COST is an inclusive, strong, interactive network. And I think that this is something that has been so interesting about our work that we've done, and really think about our deepening and involving partnerships among us and focused on bringing these diverse and historically disconnected fields together. A little bit about my personal background. I actually have been in domestic violence services for 20 plus years, and this month celebrate my 19th anniversary at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. My very first job in domestic violence services was in an 103-bed domestic violence shelter in Florida. I saw that we had somebody in Florida in Tampa in Florida over 20 years ago. And one of the reasons that I have become so passionate about this issue is that for the first 12 or 13 years of my career, I had never, not only never mentioned brain injury in my work with domestic violence survivors, but it had never even been on my radar. It had never crossed my mind. I had never thought about any of my work in the context of brain injury, ever, ever. I really honestly didn't really know what a concussion was, except for I live in Columbus, Ohio, which is the home of the Ohio State University. And we watch a lot of football in Columbus. So I knew a little bit about concussions, but I had never thought about concussions for more than the couple of minutes when we were watching a football game and they talk through the concussion protocol. And, when we got these grants, our work actually started in 2016 at our agency on this area. It was one of those things, one of the analogies I often talk about. I don't know if any of you have ever been in the market for a new car and you're looking around for cars and then you're driving around and you see that same model of car everywhere. And it isn't that there are any more of those cars. It just is you have a different perspective and you see things in different ways. So at where I am in my career from 10 years ago, if we had this, we wouldn't have had this webinar in April of 2016 because I didn't know who BIAA was. I had like two conversations with the Brain Injury Association of Ohio. I knew them well enough to ask for a letter for a grant that we were applying for, but that's it. And I think it is impossible for me to see, it is impossible for me to just fathom how I managed to do this work for so long without brain injury not being just a, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Not being just a central part of the work that we're doing, but it really is just a defining feature of domestic violence. And we are working together to build responses within survivor service systems. So whether people are accessing brain injury support services, whether people are accessing domestic violence programs. I know Heather is going to share some more about forensic nursing and what that is, or accessing healthcare. For injuries due to violence or for all of the other health impacts of domestic violence, or people who are in abusive relationships get colds or whatever that is. It really is looking to how are we building responses within those systems that we work in to help meet these holistic needs of survivors. So that's a little bit about costs, and our vision is really that every survivor of brain injury caused by domestic or sexual violence assaults in Ohio will have accessible, trauma-informed, culturally relevant support and services needed to live their best life possible. And one of the things that we learned very, very early on in this brain injury work, from my perspective in the domestic violence service system, was this is not work we could do alone. This was not work that we are, and I know Lauren will talk a little bit about recognizing we're not trying to be brain injury specialists. We're not trying to be medical providers, but just being able to have those relationships and those understanding and put these pieces together and support people around all of the different things that people are bringing into the situation. So I did want, I know that we already have had one person share with us in the Q&A box that they are a survivor of domestic violence and have experienced a brain injury due to this because of a violent assault, and it has changed my life and it has been a struggle. Um, and I think that that is something. So thank you very much. We know that there are 152 of us on this webinar today. We know we'll talk a little bit about domestic violence statistics in a little bit, but we know that there are absolutely survivors who are a part of this webinar. There are people who love people who have experienced domestic violence. Domestic Violence Awareness Month is in October, and one of our themes for the past couple of years has been everybody knows somebody, everyone knows someone. So we also know that many people get into this work, as Lauren talked about, had personal experiences with a brain injury. Many people get into this work because they have had personal experiences, be that themselves, or they grew up in a home that was unsafe, or they have a family or a friend or a loved one or a sister, or a brother or a coworker. So I think that's one thing we have to remember. We know that domestic violence impacts people of all different ages and sexes and races and socioeconomic statuses and religions and nationalities and all of that. So we just didn't want to domestic violence, and it's also hard to talk about. I think most of us wish, I know we very much wish at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network that we didn't have jobs. We wish our organization didn't need to exist. But it is hard stuff that we're talking about. We're gonna hear some stories of survivors and talking about violence, traumatic brain injury caused by violence or strangulation, suffocation, those very, very terrible things that survivors experience is just really hard. So I just did want to acknowledge that. Please take breaks as needed. I know Casey is keeping track of things on the chat, but we know, and if you needed a private message her, I think you can click on her name and send her a private message. But we are so thankful for all of the survivors who are on this call. I also know that there are many people who are coming from the brain injury space. So we have brain injury survivors, we have domestic violence survivors, we have domestic violence survivors who maybe have never had brain injuries. We have brain injury survivors who have never experienced domestic violence, but we also have that intersection. So please do whatever you need to best take care of yourself. Please, we also don't have anything super. We're going to have some brief stories of survivors, but we don't have anything really graphic, even though many of us who work in domestic violence have seen people that have been assaulted pretty severely. Because as many of you know, and we have many brain injury experts on this webinar, most people who experience brain injury and most people who experience domestic violence, guess what they look like? They look like you. They look like me. They look like all of us. And I think that that's one of the reasons why domestic violence continues to remain hidden, why often brain injury continues to remain hidden. I think that there's something that I have had, the pleasure of learning from my partners at BIAA and from Lauren and her colleagues is just how we have a lot of things there are a lot of similarities that we have in the brain injury world and in the domestic violence world when we talk about some of the lack of understanding of what a brain injury really is, lack of understanding of what domestic violence really looks like. We talk about some of the stigma and the silence and the judgment that can come through that. So we'll be talking about all of that stuff today. But just whatever you need to do, please feel free to take a break. I probably will have us take a break at some time because 2 hours is a long time for us to sit. But we are glad to have you here, and we'll tell you every survivor that has come to our training has we know that education and information is power, right? And we know that also one of the things that we learn when we do things like this is that we are not alone and it's not just us. So, and for those of you who are survivors on this webinar, please know that there are local supports, there are local resources, that local domestic violence programs, you can reach out to your local domestic violence program. You don't have to be in a situation where you are unsafe. Those resources are available to you.
I don't remember the hit. I remember everything leading up to it, but nothing after. He came from behind me. I didn't see it coming. I was hit in the side of the head. I remember being confused. My ears were ringing. It's hard to talk about. I still experience pain, mood swings. The headaches are debilitating. But this isn't my story.
It's mine.
From your thoughts, I want you to think about what makes a relationship healthy. What makes a romantic relationship healthy? What different kind of characteristics of that? What is it that looks like? Because I think that that's what all of us are aiming for. That's what many of us want. Um, and I think that I just wanted to see if people had some thoughts. If people just wanted to put in the chat some of those characteristics of a healthy relationship. So mutual respect. We talk about clear communication from Rachel. We see boundaries from Steph is talking about boundaries, a sense of safety. Other people are saying boundaries. Um, Trust and honesty, reciprocal give and take, the kind of equal partnership and honesty. I'm just reading your comments in the chat. Thank you for everybody who is sharing with us. And I think communication and respect, listening with compassion and trust, and integration with family and friends, not isolation. Those are all great, and please keep those ideas coming. I think that, and this is kind of what some of the things that we, have taught about. We think about some of those healthy relationships, and you've talked about some of these things that it can conclude things like clear, honest communication, mutual respect and trust, right? Equal decision making and comfort setting and honor comfort. You have comfort, you're comfortable setting and honoring boundaries, and you have support for each other's goals. I know that there are many states and in many initiatives having conversations and particularly talking about healthy relationships is a really, really important thing and a really, really important part for all of us to think about. What do healthy relationships look like for us? I think one of the things that we also know is that there are times in which we are working with people that not all of us have had the experience of growing up in situations or in scenarios where relationships have always been healthier. What does that look like? I think as the mother of a tween and two teenagers, I think when we think about the messages that people are getting about what healthy relationships are, what they look like, there are a lot of states that have some kind of mandated, educational class in schools about relationships and healthy relationships, or what it is that that looks like. So I think that that's a really, really important piece to really start to think about for all of us, in our experiences and in our lives. What are some of those things that those look like? And we know that healthy relationships help us do a whole lot of different things, right? They help us feel calm and supportive. They often help us sleep better and manage stress. They often help us heal from trauma. And really thinking about being your full self without fear. And I think that that is, as we talk about, I like to always start this because I think that one of the things that is really, really important in our work with domestic violence survivors is just helping people think about. I think sometimes it is very easy. Sometimes it's a lot easier. I don't know if you've ever been in a conversation, with someone, like it's a lot easier to know what you don't like about something than what you like about something. So really thinking about, ourselves, how are we showing up in healthy relationships? How are our friends and family showing up in healthy relationships? How are we helping? I mean, helping my children navigate about, it's one of those things. If any of you have teenagers, I remember I was getting ready to take one of my younger kids to the mall. She pulled up her app and she knew all of her friends that were at the mall at that time, all of them that were there. And I, coming from the domestic violence space, I think, and I'm not saying it's abusive if you use an app like Life 360 or Snap, you have location monitoring. I always find that really creepy back in the day when that was a lot harder to do, but really just even thinking about how I'm helping my young people, navigate relationships where we're in a different technological world, in a technological time, and people can be in touch all of the time. I think that that's a really important conversation for us to continue to have and as a part of the work that we do in domestic violence, because we want all relationships to be healthy. Now I'm going to ask another question. If some people want to put in some thoughts when we think about domestic violence, um, and you think about domestic violence, what do you know about domestic violence? And I'm catching up with some of their, and that doesn't mean, I mean, I think that there's something, there's a comment in the chat that I'm trying to get to. And I know Casey's responding to, so we have Casey on responding to some of these comments in the chat. I know that healthy relationships also don't mean that it's 100% perfect all of the time. And you're never, angry. You're never upset. You never say something, kind of what that is. It doesn't mean it's perfect all of the time, but we think about those boundaries that we have. But what are some of the things you know about domestic violence? So I know Dan talks about it can be subtle, right? Not physical. A lot of times when we think about domestic violence, and we'll get to talking about, kind of coercive control and power and control, sometimes domestic violence can be physical. And of course, we'll be talking about physical violence today when we think about physical violence as a cause of head injuries, but it is often not physical. I know Pam is sharing, her parents, my father tried to kill my mom at least 3 times that involved law enforcement. So we have like lots of, again, personal experience. It can be psychological or emotional. It can be financial. Violence is violence, whether it's verbal abuse. So Katrina talks about financial and coercive control. Jen talks about the emotional breakdown and self-esteem damage. So you are talking about a lot of kind of characteristics of domestic violence or of abuse that again can be physical, but there's also lots of other pieces to that, and really thinking about that emotional breakdown and self-esteem damage. I know destroying and controlling relationships with others. Deanna, I really like that you brought up the spiritual abuse, psychological and financial abuse, sometimes the whole way in which people's religion or spirituality can be used again. We know Dee talks about it can escalate over time. Those are all very, very important pieces when we talk about domestic violence. And just kind of the larger, and we talked a little bit about some of the just statistics around domestic violence, as we know, and that's what I said when we got started with this webinar, that of course we have survivors on this webinar. Of course we do, because we know that domestic violence or intimate partner violence, you might hear it called intimate partner violence. In some cases, generally those terms are used interchangeably, though in many states the legal definition of domestic violence, so the crime of domestic violence, can often include a family or household member. So it can include an intimate partner, somebody you have a child with, somebody you're in a relationship with, or a family or household member when we think about kind of criminal domestic violence in most states, though every state is different. But we know that between 1 in 2 and 1 in 5 people have experienced raped, physical violence, and or stalking by a partner at some point in their life. We know between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 people have experienced sexual violence. And we know that populations at the greatest risk are often people from underserved communities, often due to a lot of the lacks of services and supports. But when we talk about kind of this social definition of domestic violence, and many of you talked about this, talked about different aspects of this, we really want to think about this as a pattern of coercive and controlling behaviors that includes physical, sexual, and psychological attacks, as well as economic coercion that adults and adolescents use against their intimate partners. So I want you to take a minute as you look at this definition and just share with me if anybody just wants to throw in the chat, any word that kind of sticks out to that. Sticks out of that definition. What kind of pops out at you? I know that there are other one of you, so thank you, Jordan. Jordan, wherever you are, ding, 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 ding. Oh, Brooke comes in, pattern and coercion. Many of you, wherever you are, Brooke and Jordan, please get yourself some candy. If we were in a room, I would give you candy. Because I think that that is, yeah, it's one of those crazy things. Thinking about, we want to understand domestic violence is this pattern of coercive behaviors. It is not something that happens one time. And I think when we talk about the difference between, healthy, unhealthy, and abusive relationships, yes, have there been times that I have yelled at my partner? Absolutely. Yes. Has he yelled at me? Yes. Have we been happily married for 21 years? Yes. But we think about these pattern of behaviors. We think about this gaslighting. We think about it's not one thing. It's not one time. When we think about something being coercive, I want you to think, I know Deidre talks about adults and adolescents. That really fits in. We know that domestic violence can happen in younger areas. I think that we talk about those pattern of behaviors. So we really want to think about that. And I think sometimes it is those things, and I know a lot of people have talked about, someone talked about a wolf in a sheep's clothing. Some of us have talked about they're kind of subtle. These behaviors aren't even super easy to identify sometimes. And I have worked with, I don't even know how many domestic violence survivors who have said to me, not that they have no domestic violence survivors have ever said, well, actually, somewhat like I don't really mean this, but say like I wish he would just hit me, or I wish they would just hit me. And no, they don't really wish they would just hit me, but there's all of these behaviors that you kind of can't put your hands on, and like now you're in the situation and you don't quite know how they got there, but there isn't this like thing that happened. I know Elaine talks about that intent versus accidental or inadvertent behaviors, out of control versus a slip up. Yeah. So when we talk about domestic violence and we think about coercive control, and if anybody wants to talk in the chat about, thank you for all of your engagement in chat. Jordan talks about it's often hard to verbalize. It can be some of that love bombing, but when something's coercive, think about what that means to you. And what coercion often means to me is it's just like, and we get this all the time. We'll talk a little bit about why survivors stay and, some of those barriers to leaving. But, we talk about that all the time where we often get people who tell us like, oh, well, if my partner ever did that to me, there's no way I would put up with that. And I like to say, well, if you are in a situation where it is safe for you to do those things, then you're probably not in an abusive relationship because coercion really introduces that element of force, that element of fear, that element of consequences, that element of like you aren't just able to make your own decisions, and there are consequences from what that is and what that looks like. So when we talk about coercive control, again, that pattern of coercive behaviors, one of the things that often one of the goals of that is really to strip away a person's freedom and sense of self, right? Some of you had talked about that. We often see things like degradation. So, degradation and humiliation, some of those mind games that we've talked about, that gaslighting, where, I actually worked with a domestic violence survivor once who used to, I don't know if any of you like put your keys in the same place all the time because you lose your keys, which is something that I do. Very much a brain injury compensatory strategy, which we'll talk about later. But so she'd put her keys down by the door because she'd lose them if she didn't. And she'd walk away and her partner would hide her keys and then she'd go all around the house. And then while she was upstairs, he would put them back and then he would belittle her and call her stupid and call her, and make her feel like, she was stupid and she was so lucky that he put up with somebody and nobody else would ever put up with her and kind of what all those things are. The surveillance that sometimes happen with people being, I've talked a little bit about how technology has made surveillance much, much easier, about how people being followed, people being tracked, people having to account for their time and where they are. And then when we talk about micro-regulation, that is a term that often people aren't familiar with, but sometimes that is the ways it can look in which people get very controlling about things that don't really matter, that don't really make a difference. The way in which domestic violence survivors have been often, verbally abused or those kind of things about how they cleaned, about what they're wearing, about kind of these little details in life that don't really matter. But this just depiction right here, which you'll see on the left, is what's called the power and control wheel. You can feel free to Google that and learn a little bit more about it. But these are some of this was actually created by domestic violence survivors to kind of help us understand what are some of those things, again, those subtle ways in which abuse can happen. And I can't tell you how many times I've worked with domestic violence survivors who have told me, I don't know how I got here. Like I'm in this situation and I feel like I can't go where I want to go. I can't talk to who I wanted to. I'm walking on eggshells all the time. But it wasn't like one day my partner was like, you can't go here, you can't talk to this person. I'm gonna make you like it's just like here I am and I'm kind of stuck and I don't know how that happened. And we see how some of these things when we talk about intimidation and coercion and threats and emotional abuse and isolation, some of the minimizing, denying, and blaming, where we often hear, people saying, well, you made me do this. You forced me to do these kind of things. We know children can be a particularly powerful tool in abuse. And when I used to work in shelter, one of the things we used to talk to domestic violence survivors who were attempting to safely escape relationships was how sometimes things get a little more difficult with children before they get easier because that becomes my partner's tool of control. About how that whole piece around kind of what that is and how children can become just kind of get caught up in the middle of this. When we talk about privilege, we know that domestic violence, I very, very much want to acknowledge that domestic violence can happen to women, it can happen to men, it can happen to people in all different types of relationships. But we know that when we think about privilege, there are ways in which our privileges can be used against us. So one of the things that we talk about a privilege, many of us might be in situations where we might not have a disability. And there's a lot of things I don't have to think about because I don't have a physical disability. Well, we have survivors who might have a physical disability and their partner takes away their cane or their walking, kind of what that is can look like. There are ways in which people use immigration status against survivors. There are ways in which people use language, kind of people who speak different languages. So it can look different for different people, and you identified a lot of these different components. But when we talk about coercive control, it really is around like what am I controlling? It is those my body. It is where I go and my movements and my thoughts. It could be my feelings about myself and other. I know many of you talked about how abuse can be physical, but also can be emotional, also can be psychological. Many domestic violence survivors also say that, it is often what we talk about, the things that stay with them, the things that are often with them for years and years are things related to that emotional abuse and that like I don't believe in myself. I don't that's what, gaslighting tries to undermine, right? I don't trust my own instincts. I don't think I'm a good parent. And do I really not think I'm a good parent? Or was that I was told for years I was not a good parent? That kind of piece, I say that often stays with them. It changes them. And talking about the financial abuse, when we think about the financial abuse and the way that that looks, that they can create sometimes the financial abuse around, you know, preventing people from getting jobs. I had a domestic violence survivor I worked with who was, assaulted very severely the night before she was taking her nursing exams. She didn't show up for her nursing exam, so she didn't get her nursing license. We think about ruining people's credit. We think about doing those kind of things. And then we think about mental health and substance use coercion, where sometimes survivors often report that their partners do things intentionally to make them think they're crazy and they call them crazy and they say those kind of things or they interfere. They try to introduce them to substances. Sometimes survivors can prevent, abusers can prevent survivors from going to get health care if they need health care. And then some of the pressure that we have around reproductive coercion is things like pressuring people about getting pregnant, pressuring people about ending pregnancies that maybe are using birth control, or kind of what this needs to look like. So I hope that one of the things that this is helping us think about, not only how we have to understand what abuse looks like, but what are all of the things that we need to be talking about and thinking about when we're thinking about healthy relationships and we're thinking about what it is that looks like. And thank you to all of you who are sharing in the chat, and sharing your personal experiences. Again, you are such important. We learned all of this, that Power and Control Wheel was created by survivors for survivors. So we learned all of this information from you. And just like in the brain injury world, it's very, very important that we continue to not only listen to, but to be directed by people who are experiencing these things. I'm going to stop really quickly. As you see, I can get to talking very, very fast. But I'm going to stop really quickly, and see if there is, Casey, is there any, I know Casey, you all are keeping Casey busy. Is there any questions or comments that we want to make sure to, and I'm sorry I just will get too wrapped up in the chat, and then we will be here. Nobody wants to, I know you all want to be here with me for several hours, um but is there anything that we need to particularly address, or anything Lauren or Heather or Casey would like to add?
Yep, I've got a couple of questions in the chat that we can either answer now or save to the end. Oh, thank you, Lauren. Looks like Lauren put some resources in the chat for one of our questions from one of our participants. So if you put a question in the chat and you're waiting on an answer from me or Lauren, go ahead and check that out. And then we also have another question here, curious about TBI as a risk factor for perpetrating domestic violence. Is that a known risk factor? So if that's something we'd like to address or save for later, I will leave that up to you.
Yeah, I just want to, and we're going to be able, that is absolutely something that we need to better understand. I think that there's a lot of things when we talk about, one of the things that I hope you're also learning in a part of this webinar is abuse is very complex and very complicated. And you can have people who grew up in very similar situations in the same family, going to the same schools with the same teachers. And some of you might be not in situations of abuse, but you might have, I mean, you've got, 2 or 3 kids. They all have had the same parents. They've all gone to the same schools. They've all done the same things. They're all very different. They make very different choices. They have very different experiences. So I'm going to go social worker for just a minute on you, if that's okay. But there's this model that's called the social ecological model. And it's kind of like there's a person who's inside a family, who's inside a community, who's inside a society. And like I impact my family impacts me, my family impacts my community impacts there's all these like back and forth between those levels, and how things line up for somebody to be in a situation where they're in an abusive relationship, or somebody to be in a situation where they're violent with their partners, is just very, very complex and complicated. I do think that one of the things that we talk about when talking about abuse, I do think TBI, or brain injury, among people who use violence, is something that has not been explored to the depth that it needs to. And we do have some experience and some research, particularly for those of you who might be a little older like me, when we had a large a large group of troops that were overseas, that were deployed during the wars in the Middle East, did sometimes have individuals who had TBI histories who did not have histories from abuse, who would come back, and that looked very differently. But I do think it's one of those things when we think about how we have to also be very, very careful that we're not turning things. I always say, we'll talk a little bit about trauma in a minute, that there's a difference between an explanation to something and an excuse for something. We also know many, many survivors with traumatic brain injury who are not violent at all. And we know that often we see what this coercive control looks like and the physical violence look like. It's very targeted at a specific person in a specific situation. Often they're not people who are having problems at work, and they're getting into fights with their coworkers, and they're getting into, kind of all of those kind of things. So it is, I think that that's one of the things, one of the myths I think about abuse is that, some people think like, oh, just lost control and, I snapped. Which is often, again, that's that minimizing and denying stuff that we were talking about earlier. But you only lost abuse and snapped with this one person. You didn't lose abuse and snap when you were at church. You didn't lose it and snap when you were at work. You didn't lose it and snap, in all of these other situations. And we have heard that. And guess what? When the police showed up, you were nice and calm, and you were nice and charming, and you were nice and all of that kind of stuff. So I know that that might be a little bit longer of an answer than you would like. But I think it is when we talk about all of those different things that contribute to people using violence, all of those different things that contribute to people being in situations where they're victimized by violence. There's a lot of different things, and I think TBI has not maybe had its due attention in that. I don't know, Lauren, do you have anything you want to add to that question? I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but kind of bringing this from like a brain injury perspective, which is why this collaboration is freaking fabulous.
Yeah, so I would add to that we do see from the folks that we serve, both, folks that are coming to us that have experienced maybe some intimate partner violence that didn't have a previous history with brain injury, and this is a new situation for them. And then we get calls, I would say, with almost equal frequency from individuals that are involved in legal cases that are perpetrators of abuse that have also had a history of a TBI. So we do definitely see that cycle of abuse. Just from the TBI perspective, we know that upwards of close to 85% of our incarcerated population has a history of a TBI. So maybe not exactly, Deirdre, what you're referencing here, but we do know that TBI is correlated in some way to violence, to abuse, and that sort of thing. So it is definitely a common concern, and we work with both sides of that in providing services, and trying to do some work also with just the justice system, right, and getting folks to understand what a brain injury is and how it's impacting somebody's behavior, and that perhaps just locking somebody up and not addressing the medical concern of the brain injury is not going to solve the problem. And so, being a little bit more sensitive to the fact that the brain injury needs to be addressed and accommodations need to be put in place and appropriate treatment needs to come in as well. And unfortunately, what we know from the work that we do is just the awareness is not there, right? The awareness about brain injury, not only in the domestic violence space, but just in general medical provider space is not fantastic, as well as in the legal system. And so that is one of the things that we are trying to do, is to just improve the awareness that brain injury is a thing and that people need to be screening for it and paying attention to it, and need to be aware how it could alter interactions within their own systems.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And I think, again, having these discussions with people who have that background in brain injury and people who have that background in domestic violence and people who have, background in healthcare is really what has made our collaboration so fruitful. You all have talked about many of these different types of domestic violence, including the economic abuse, the sexual abuse, the psychological abuse, and the physical abuse and emotional abuse. Shared lots of examples of that. I would like to add, I think that there's a couple. I know that we have talked briefly about spiritual abuse, thinking about how that can be one of those other ways in which that happens, as well as technology abuse. So thinking about the whole role again of technology these days, where there are trackers, I mean, it is something that, we used to have, here's some of the red flags that we were talking about, what those things can look like. It used to be a lot harder, in the 70s and 80s when we built shelters, you could really have places that are kind of secret and private, and it is just so much harder to do that anymore. So these are what some of those red flags of abuse that can look like, that we want to be paying attention to, that we want to be thinking of. I think one of the other things when talking about some of the isolation, I know that one of the points and the pieces on the power control wheel is that whole role of isolation. And one of the things is in isolation, I mean, I think that that's when we think about, maybe I'm not spending as much time with people, maybe other people aren't noticing what this is and what that looks like. But, I think the other thing that we need to recognize about abuse is that how many times have we had domestic violence stories that have come out in the general media or in the public, and everybody never would have guessed. never would have guessed. Like they didn't look like that and didn't think like that at all. So I do think that there are some ways what we do know is that people who use violence can often be very manipulative. And sometimes that manipulation can be scary and threatening. And sometimes that manipulation can be charming and can be sweet and really, really understanding what those dynamics are and what those look like. So you think about all of those kind of things. Why do you think a domestic violence survivor might have some hesitations? And you can ask some of the answer some of these things in the chat. um why might it be something, and I wish it was something that was easy, it was as easy as saying, oh, we just have to ask people about domestic violence and they'll just tell us. But we talk about some of the things that talking about, really thinking about some of the reasons why domestic violence survivor might struggle to share what has happened to them. We know about people feeling judged. We know about that's a lot of that, those dynamics of abuse, the embarrassment. I know if any of you have ever heard that that saying that we have, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. I mean, thinking about all of the ways, feeling judged, what are the repercussions, it being weaponized against people, people talking about the lack of financial resources in organizations, feeling some of that shame. So I think the other thing is a lot of times we don't talk about these kind of deep issues in relationships, with our relationships with people we don't know and we don't trust, which is one of the reasons why I'm so glad we're having this webinar for. We do a lot of work with professionals who work in different areas, and I know many of you are caregivers, survivors, and professionals who work in lots of different areas. But most people, guess what? Most people talk to first when they are in a relationship, and maybe it's a relationship that is unhealthy, that hasn't like turned the corner to abuse yet. Who do they talk to first? They for sure are not calling our domestic violence hotlines. They're talking to their families, they're talking to their friends, they're talking to their coworker. They're sharing some of those kind of things. So I think all of us have something that we can do to really help that. I think I'm actually going to actually we're going to take a minute. We're not going to end up watching this video because what I want you to do is I want to do just a quick exercise with you. And I want you all to think about a time in your life when you needed to make a change. And nothing traumatic, nothing big, but maybe you needed a new job. Maybe you maybe you had a relationship. Probably most of us have had a relationship that hung around a little longer than it should. Maybe you needed to go back to school. Maybe you needed a career change. Maybe, you needed to move out or a roommate or, do something different. And I want you to list just a couple, I want you to think about in your head 5 reasons why you did not make that a change immediately. When you were like, this is not the job for me. Why didn't you walk right in to your office? Or now we don't walk into offices because a lot of us work from home, but why didn't you just quit? Well, this is not what I want to do. I'm just going to quit my job. Whatever that situation was. So, no, Dan talks about fear of the unknown, right? Yes, Laura, I will make sure to provide that video. I will make sure one of the things that I will do, all of the links that we have in this video and all of our resources, I will follow up with Laura from BIAA and we'll make sure to send that out, okay? Send that out to you. I know Caitlin talks about feeling too comfortable. For most of us, like maybe we don't love our jobs, but like we get vacations off and oh, I'm getting a raise next year and maybe I'll have a new supervisor. People talk about like maybe it feels normal. I have a feel of failure. I was letting my clients down. I needed to pay bills. So there were like financial reasons, kind of what that was. It's all of those kind of things when thinking about fear and belief in oneself. You're not sure if you can do it. Anybody ever heard another statement we have, the devil that you know is better than the devil that you don't know? You didn't know what to expect. So I think that one of the things, you had obligations. What were other people gonna think? I think the other thing we really want to understand about relationships, just like I said, even if I am in a super healthy relationship with my husband, our relationship is not perfect. It is not perfect all of the time. There are good pieces to people, right? We know that a lot of times that, people make mistakes and abusers. I wish this is one thing I really want us to understand. Abusers are not bad, terrible, horrible things, horrible people all the time. There are times that are very caring, they are very loving, they are very, so people stay in situations. Maybe you stayed with a person that maybe you didn't want to be with them forever, but you loved them. How much does hope, how much does hope keep us in situations that are bad for us, right? Or that maybe aren't ideal for us? Because we hope things can change. It's a good thing that we have hope. Um, and I know Kelsey said good days can make you feel like things can get better and be fixed, right? So I think one of the things I want us to remember when people ask, first of all, why don't you leave is not the right question. The other thing that we need to know about domestic violence is often the most dangerous time for leaving a domestic an abusive relationship is the most dangerous time for a domestic violence survivor. We know that 75% of domestic violence homicides occur when people have are in the process of leaving or have left relationships. Leaving a relationship doesn't mean that you just are out. And I think that that's another difference. If you are in a relationship that you can just be like, I'm good, I'm done, and it's fine, then that relationship probably was not abusive. But I think so the question that we need to be asking is why does this person do this? Why does the abuser get away with it? But people don't leave relationships for very, very much the same reasons that all of you stayed in situations that were not good for you, right? And you talked about many of these things. We talked about and we also know that leaving or making changes in our lives is a process, right? It's not an event. It's not like something that happens once. We don't just wake up one day and have a new job. We don't just wake up one day and show up in college. We don't just wake up one day and retire. It is a process. And a lot of times, the other thing I get, well, why do these people keep going back and coming back? And how many times when you were going to quit your job were you like, ooh, well, this thing happened. Oh, I can do this. I can stay. Things will get better. Like that is just how people make big life decisions. And one of the things that you hopefully were not worried about quitting your job was you were not worried about your boss trying to take your kids away from you, right? You weren't worried about your boss threatening your pets or threatening your family members or threatening to ruin your reputation or telling, all of your friends at church about, certain things that you did. So I think that it is one of those things that it's all the same reasons that we stay in relationships. But I think again with this whole, thank you for Casey made the slide for putting the brain injury in purple. That is something that I would not have included in this conversation a few years ago, thinking about how brain injury can contribute to people staying in relationships and what it is that that looks like. We're going to spend just a couple more minutes talking about a few more things, then I promise I will pass this over to my esteemed colleague. But when we think about, we just want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about trauma and kind of trauma and what the difference between stress and trauma is. And I know that there is so much going on in the chat right now, but I just wanted to ask, when you think about this whole kind of thing, when you think about you've been in a situation in your life about something is stressful, what is the difference between something being stressful and something being traumatic? Is there something, we have been times that have been challenging, that have been stressful, but maybe not traumatic. And I think it's really, really important when we talk about working at the intersection of domestic violence and brain injury. We have to have a really, really good understanding of coercive control, and we have to have a really, really good understanding of trauma. So Renee talks about stress is the response and trauma is what happens from the experience. So thinking about kind of that difference, anybody else with, so what is something that is different about something being traumatic versus something being stressful? A lot of people say stressful, obviously stress, a lot of times stressful periods end, right? It's something that, we get through, that we get over. Trauma can be long lasting. It can leave those long lasting effects. So I just want to share with you, you can continue to keep your trauma can involve personal safety, can cause triggers. It's more overwhelming. So this is actually a framework from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, that talks about the 3 E's of trauma, being an event, experience, and effects. So we want to think about, and one of the things I want you to recognize very, very much when we're thinking about it, for those of you who work in the brain injury world, can brain injury be a traumatic event? Absolutely. Is it traumatic for everybody? Not necessarily, not in the same way, but I think that this really helps us also understand there's lots of events, series of events or set of circumstances. So we're starting by understanding E. The first E is event. The second E is how I experience that event. So, for example, can a job loss be traumatic in some situations? Absolutely. With the survivors and the clients that I work with, if they lose their job, they are homeless, they are in danger, they are, I mean, and it's in a different situation. If I lost my job right now, my husband is an engineer. Could I be unemployed forever? No, but I'm not going to immediately be homeless. I don't have an open, Child Protective Services case that something's going to happen, my kids are going to get taken away, those kind of things. But it's an event, series of events or set of circumstances that how I experience that by an individual is physically harmful or threatening. This is also something that we have to remember. People filter the present through their past, right? And you and I might be in the same situation, have the same event happen and experience it very differently. I like to use a very simple example of you might react differently to dogs if you have ever been bitten by a dog. Makes total sense. This is actually your brain and body doing what it does, amazing work to protect you. Because a part of our brain and body's job is to remember what is dangerous. But so if I had somebody, I have my puppy my baby who's sleeping right next to me. Somebody could come into my house and be really scared, and it's very easy for me to say like, "What's wrong with her?" Or, like, she's a freaking golden doodle. She's not gonna hurt anybody. But if you have had a negative, scary experience with a dog, of course you would have that reaction. But then we think about, you all talked about these effects, the lasting adverse effects on their functioning, physical, emotional, social, or spiritual well-being. So sometimes stress doesn't change us, but sometimes when we think about how we're functioning, kind of what our physical health is, what our body is, how we're relating to people. We have heard, I think one of the things I know people have talked about spiritual abuse. We've heard one of the things about spiritual abuse being about how um, you know, the way in which religion or spirituality or higher power can be enormously damaging in abuse, can also be enormously healing. But we think about how I understand my place in the world, how I relate to other people, and we know that trauma responses can also look very different for different people, right? I remember when working in shelter, I would have some survivors who would come and who would say, I am never, ever, 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 ever going to have a date again, ever for the rest of my life. I am never going out with anybody. I am never being in a relationship. I also had domestic violence survivors who were like, back in the day, it was a lot harder. Like, there weren't all these, dating websites and all of those and apps. But I had survivors who were immediately looking for another partner. And it wasn't right or wrong, but it's just it can impact people differently, and everybody's trauma reaction and trauma response is different. But these are some of the things. So we also think about when talking about this intersection of trauma, domestic violence, and brain injury. We know trauma can make it harder for us to manage and regulate feelings, for us to calm ourselves down, for us to trust others, for us to have the energy to get things done, for us to tell our stories. This might be some other things that contribute. Sometimes I don't know how many of you know a very common trauma reactions, a couple of very common trauma reactions. Sometimes it can be hypervigilance, which is like we're keyed up and we're on alert all the time and we're jumpy and we're watching out. Some of you might also respond by there's avoidance reaction. So what I try to do is I try to not think about it. I try to pretend like it never happened. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to do any of those kind of things. Those are all appropriate, but we know it increases chances of tension, anxiety, panic, and emotional volatility. Some of that avoidance, constriction, and disassociation, and use of drug or alcohol or other addictions to manage symptoms. So when we think about the health piece related to relationships, we know that domestic violence can cause physical and emotional harm, that effects may continue long after the abuse ends. And we know that recognizing the way in which our health, the impacts of domestic violence, including brain injury, is a first good step towards healing. And like Lauren said earlier, the whole lack of awareness we have around this general issue. Um, we can't address something that we haven't ever put a name on, that we haven't ever put an understanding on. When we talk about physical health of impacts of domestic violence, we'll spend just a few more minutes talking about it. Then we'll take a quick break, and then we're going to transition to my partners here. But we know physical violence can cause bruises, cuts, broken bones, head or facial injuries, and other bodily injuries. But we know that domestic violence can also have lots of physical health impacts, which is one of the reasons why we're so thrilled to be partnering with those in healthcare and forensic nursing, who you'll learn a little bit more about in a little bit. We know it can connect to sleeping or fatigue, with vision or eye issues. There can be digestive issues related to that stress response. We know that mental and emotional health effects of abuse can be just as serious as physical injuries, and often domestic violence survivors say much more long lasting. People can experience depression, anxiety, or panic attacks, some of the post traumatic stress disorder. I think that I always like, whenever people call it post-traumatic stress disorder, I actually think a lot of times domestic violence survivors' responses are actually, first of all, it's often not a disorder. And it's often not post, because a lot of times survivors are still, even if they've separated from their partner, they might still be connected. Their partner might still be out there. But I think a lot of these are the trauma responses that are very, very common and normal responses to being in a situation where you are unsafe. And I think that that's something else we also need to remember about leaving an abusive relationship doesn't necessarily mean safety. And sometimes that increases the risk. We know that there are feelings of fear, shame, and hopelessness. There's increased risk of alcohol, using alcohol or drugs, or thoughts of self-harm and suicide. And then some of the longer term health impacts. Long-term stress from domestic violence can increase risk of all of these different things, of unexplained health issues, of heart disease, of weakened immune system, of cognitive issues, of ongoing mental health challenges and reproductive issues. And I will tell you, one of the things as we have gotten, deeper and deeper into this brain injury world, I get emails or, people reaching out to me from all over the country kind of about this intersection. And there are so many survivors who have been out of relationships, abusive relationships for 10 to 15 years, a very, very long time. And one of the things that they often talk to me about, they have two main problems often with job performance and work, and some of these long-term health impacts. And many of them have said, many of them have had terrible histories of head injuries and have said, like, have said, I just never, ever, ever crossed my mind. I just never considered. Nobody had ever shared anything with me about the possibility that I could have a brain injury, or I could have been impacted by brain injury, and that then those brain injuries have long-term impacts. And I think that that's what makes me very, very proud, kind of what that is and what it is that that looks like. So, we think about how domestic violence is related to brain injury. So we're going to spend some time really, really talking about this. Domestic violence related to brain injury and what it is that that looks like and kind of how we got into that work. And as you're sharing some of those comments, what I am going to do is I'm going to show some of those, a very quick video when we got our very first grant related to this. We had, as I said, I had worked at the statewide coalition for over a decade, had never once mentioned brain injury at anything. And we got this grant, and as I said, we work with 76 domestic violence programs across the country. And I mean, across the state. And we had never had these conversations with our programs. And we went to start talking to our programs. We went to start talking to people who worked at our programs, talked to survivors, did some research with the Ohio State University. And this is just a quick 3-minute video about what we learned related to some of those when we started talking about this with our domestic violence member programs. So
you hear people talk about evil in someone's eyes, like he looked through me like I wasn't even there. And I remember him putting his hands around my throat and like thinking like, I'm going to die.
When we think about the first picture of a domestic violence victim, the kind of classic iconic image of a battered woman as a woman with a black eye, right? Which one of the things that I realized now in the context of this work is she very well could have had a concussion in the context of that black eye, but it is something that none of us in the field have thought about.
And I don't remember much after that, but a nosy neighbor saved my life. Like somebody had heard all the stuff going on and knocked on the door, and that was the only reason I'm still alive.
And how we hadn't, it's one of those things you say it, you look at the data, we talk about brain injury and hits to the head, and it becomes very obvious very quickly. But even in my role at my organization as a statewide leader, having led a trauma-informed initiative across the state, trained in other states about the work that I was doing, never once had I mentioned brain injury. And how did we manage to miss that?
81% had reported being hit in the head. 50% or so many times that they couldn't remember. And 83% of the survivors working with the organizations reported that they had been choked or strangled so that their brains had been deprived of oxygen.
And the sad part for me is I'm an EMS educator. Like I teach trauma. That's like one of the things I love. And yet, even though as much as I know about trauma, I totally missed the strangulation part, the brain, and the effects that it's had on my body.
Many survivors who have been living with unmet need regarding brain injury intervention for a long time do end up developing comorbid issues like mental health issues and substance use issues, struggles with suicide. So unless we're identifying the underlying brain injury early, there can be other long-term health impacts for survivors of domestic violence who are not receiving the services that they need.
At one point, I attempted suicide. And so it was like, if they would have found this earlier, like, you know, my family has watched, and my friends and family have watched me, you know, try to end my own life and stuff. And it's like, that all could have been avoided had the right people had the right knowledge.
This has just kind of changed how we think about things and how we want to do things. And we're very, very hungry for helping us tackle this, because this really hasn't been tackled in this way before, and helping us from a practice level figure out what this needs to look like in the very complicated, very challenging work that domestic violence agencies do. So we will make sure to include that link when we send a follow-up with you. But again, was very, very just stark that we had over 80% of survivors telling us that they had had pretty extensive histories of head trauma. And, you know, many of them had been choked or strangled, many of them repeatedly. And the fact that we literally didn't know anything about brain injury, and we had never talked about brain injury. We had spent years talking about, decades talking about trauma, but bringing this brain injury piece in has really been transformative to us. We're going to go ahead and why don't we take a 5-minute break, and we are going to come back. If people want to take a little stretch break, I have 1:14 at my time. We'll come back at 1:20, and we're going to hear from our partners now, talking a little bit more about kind of this intersection, and hear from our brain injury partners and our forensic nursing partners about their role and their understanding of this. So thank you all for coming back. Thank you all for, again, I had a little bit of opportunity to look through the chat. Thank you all. I know that this is everything that everybody has shared in the chat and in the Q&A. Thank you to my friends and my colleagues for answering as many of those questions as possible. Thank you to all the survivors who have shared their stories as a critically important part of some of the education from all of us. One of the founders, I don't know if you remember from the beginning, our power and control wheel, which had all of the different tactics of abuse and all the different ways, and the coercion and the gaslighting and the using children and all of that. One of the things that she always said is that we're all students and we're all teachers, and we all have something to learn from each other, and we all have something to teach each other. And so you all are teaching each other so many different things. So I just thank you and appreciate that. We are going to pass the mic over as we get to kind of continuing this conversation on this overlap in this intersection of brain injury and domestic violence. And I'm going to pass the virtual mic over to my friend and partner in crime, Lauren, from the Brain Injury Association of Ohio, to kind of help kind of continue this conversation of what brain injury and domestic violence and how this intersection looks, and what are some of the considerations bringing in this brain injury perspective. And as I said, Lauren, it is fantastic to have the opportunity to work with you and see you as often as I do. And just thank you so much for the amazing ways that you and your organization have contributed to our work in domestic violence, and continue. And I'm very, very excited to continuing to do this together for a very long time.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm so grateful to be a part of the collaboration. BIOH is really grateful, as well as grateful to be able to be here today and talk a little bit about this topic. We are really looking to, as Rachel alluded to, I often say, we don't want to be domestic violence experts, but we do want to be domestic violence informed, so that we can improve our practices. And part of our goal is to also help those in the domestic violence space not necessarily have to become brain injury experts. They don't need that added to their plate of things to do, but just to be, brain injury informed. And so, a great deal of our collaboration is really just working to improve the things that we're already doing, not necessarily take on new work. All of the different social service areas are definitely stretched thin. And so we just want to improve upon the practices we already have. And so Rachel touched a little bit earlier about how, brain injury can occur as part of domestic violence, whether it's a blow to the head or shaking or a fall or strangulation. There's lots of different ways that a brain injury can happen. Quite often, we refer in the brain injury space, if you come from that world, to brain injury as being the invisible epidemic. So it's something that is often not seen, and that is part of what complicates things for survivors in seeking assistance and being diagnosed with a brain injury, right? Because it is not something that's immediately evident upon looking at them. So, but definitely, as you can see, lots of different mechanisms that are common in domestic violence can cause a brain injury. So it's something that we really encourage folks to be looking out for in screening to see if there's a possibility of a brain injury so that we can get folks connected to providers that are going to be able to assist with that. Next slide. There we go. So what makes it so hard to see? So one of the things, it is an invisible problem. And so often you will look at somebody and have no idea that they've had a brain injury, right? They're not going to look different. They're not necessarily going to speak different. And every injury is different. So some people may have some changes that are more obvious than others. But very often there are not obvious changes. And so it's not immediately visible. Now, oftentimes there is a loss of consciousness involved, but it's not a required part of a brain injury. You can have a brain injury and not have a loss of consciousness. So when folks are asking, have you had a loss of consciousness? And oh, no, you didn't. And just kind of moving on to the next step and kind of dismissing that anything could be going on from a neurological perspective. That's one of the challenges for the folks that we work with, because that is a myth out there. And then just as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we do at the Brain Injury Association of Ohio is really work on awareness in the community of brain injury, because a lot of folks don't think about brain injury until it happens in their life, and then they get, unfortunately, educated out of need and necessity. And so a lot of times folks won't necessarily realize that it's a possibility if they're a survivor in an intimate partner violence situation that may have been hit in the head. They may not realize that brain injury is a possibility. So, we want to make sure that we're out there screening for folks and helping them get connected, because it may not have even crossed their mind. And then symptoms being misread. This is one of the things that we deal with across the board with the survivors that we work with, is that a lot of the symptoms that can come about after a brain injury can look like other things. It can look like somebody's been using substances. It can look like somebody has just maybe been confused or had migraines, or it can look like a lot of other things. And so sometimes those symptoms get misattributed and dismissed. And so that's one of the things that makes getting survivors connected to services so hard, is because a lot of times it just gets missed because it's put into another bucket. Well, you must just be experiencing anxiety, or you must have been drinking or using drugs or something like that. And we'll talk a little bit too about sometimes, some of the challenges that happen after brain injury, not only get misinterpreted, but also get negatively labeled. That people aren't following through with directions when we ask them to do something, or they're not completing the forms that we're asking them to do, or they're forgetting their appointments. And that negative connotation, right, gets associated with that, saying that you're being non-compliant, or you're not trying, and that is absolutely 100% not true. Those things are often related to that brain injury, right? That brain injury is making it difficult for folks to remember things, to be able to complete forms. Forms are one of the biggest things that we hear across the board from our survivors, is just filling out a form is challenging. And so, a lot of those things that then providers in the community, whether it's a healthcare provider or a social service provider, may be thinking, well, she doesn't even want to do this because she's not following through. That then complicates their journey, right? Because they're not receiving the same level of services because they're interpreted as not being a willing participant. So again, we are looking to inform our practices from a domestic violence perspective, and then also inform domestic violence practices from a brain injury perspective. That's really what our role in the collaboration is focused on. And we're just trying to understand the connection and be able to help folks recognize brain injury through screening and identification, through training, making sure that folks in the community are trained on what brain injury is, what brain injury isn't, and then helping folks to learn how to respond. And so that means that we're helping folks understand, what common symptoms of brain injury are, what those challenges might look like in real life, and how to respond differently. So whether it's, if you've got a giant form that you need to fill, have somebody fill out, helping them to understand, helping that provider to understand that you can't just hand somebody a big form and say, go fill this out. You need to offer some sort of accommodation or support to help them do that. So whether it's connecting them to their local brain injury association so that they can help them fill it out, getting them connected to some other case management service that might be able to assist with that. But really looking to how do we change that response? Once we've identified that brain injury is a concern, we've screened, we've determined that this is a possibility, changing that response to be more brain injury sensitive. Are we trying to meet with survivors in the middle of a domestic violence program with, 50 other people in the room and lights and noises and trying to interview them? Probably not going to be super successful, right? Because a lot of folks after an injury have challenges with being overstimulated, with lights, with sounds, and all those sensory inputs. And so, it could be a real simple change of just saying, when I meet with you, I'm going to take you to a quiet, calm area with no other people, shut the door, make sure that, the lights aren't bothering you, and just make those changes. And so we work with folks to help them change how they're responding. And then reframing, right? So that again is looking at the symptoms or challenges that may arise after brain injury as a symptom or challenge that's directly related to that neurological condition and not a character flaw, right? This is not somebody not wanting to participate. This is not somebody being non-compliant. This is not somebody being argumentative. This is a direct cause coming from their brain injury. And so being able to reframe that for folks in the community so that people understand that this is really more about the brain injury and less about the person's personality or willingness to participate. So I've touched a little bit on how having a brain injury complicates things for brain injury survivors. But if you think about, for those of you that have come from the brain injury space and maybe already had a brain injury, some of the challenges that arise afterwards just make navigating systems of care challenging. The healthcare world is challenging. The domestic violence world is challenging. And then trying to coordinate getting services from both or being able to be put in touch with both while having difficulty with, maintaining your safety, with, possibly maintaining the safety of your children, with trying to maintain a job, with having difficulty with your memory, with having headaches and fatigue, maybe some difficulty with some initiation or motivation. It makes it incredibly challenging for folks to get from point A to point B and do the things that are going to help them come out successful on the other side. And so that's where, again, we're dealing with something that is often invisible. Folks may not immediately recognize that you've had a brain injury. And so that presents a challenge for them and how they're responding to you. And also, all of the steps that it often takes to get engaged in services, whether you're going to, apply for assistance in your local community and the forms that might take and the appointments that might take. So all of those challenging steps that become extra challenging after you've had a brain injury complicates folks getting the help that they need to be successful. We see this in Ohio all the time. So this just talks a little bit about the real life impact of the things that could potentially be challenging and impeding somebody's ability to get access to the care that they need and to the support they need. So we talked a little bit about memory, remembering that you have an appointment. You may sit down with a case manager and talk about a safety plan and put a plan in place, and then, walk out of that office and, the next day completely forget all the components that you agreed to and what that plan looks like. Great. And critical details of just figuring out what is the next step. Where am I going to go from here? Who is my, my contact in the community? So that memory piece can really impede somebody's ability to move forward in the process. Often, when you go interact with any kind of social service agency, so whether you're working on housing or you're working for benefits and that sort of thing, there's often a multi-step process to go through. And a lot of times it's not written down. It's something that somebody verbally tells you over the phone or in person. These are the things you need to do. And it may be difficult, A, to remember all of those instructions, but B, just to process and follow them. And so that can impede somebody's ability to move forward in the process. I talked a little bit about paperwork. Paperwork is very commonly the most frustrating parts of the process. And unfortunately, every component of the system has paperwork associated with it. Just the environment of where you need to go, right? Are you going into a place that maybe makes you feel unsafe? And so you're, reluctant to go to that place, to take that next step. Is it overwhelming? Is there, bright lights and lots of people and loud noises? Those can all complicate things as well. And communication is particularly challenging after brain injury. Like your ability to articulate your thoughts, your feelings, your needs. Part of that is the brain injury, potentially, depending on where you had your injury, how severe the injury was. But some of it can also just be the trauma response as well, and the difficulty feeling safe enough to express your needs and where you need to go next. And we also are frequently working with folks that are struggling to return to work, right? You've potentially sustained this injury and you need to get back to work because you need income to support you, to support your family. But that job may be, something that is not necessarily attainable at this moment based on the injury, maybe due to some cognitive changes or some pain or some fatigue. And so working with folks to try to help them get back to work and return to caring for their children as well. All of these components really can make it challenging for folks to navigate all the steps and process to get to safety, to get to a place where they're on the other side of their situation. And really at the association, we take calls every day. And I have this really pretty graphic. I didn't stick it in here, but of why people call us. And the reality is that calling us about their brain injury is actually pretty low on the list. We are often contacted because of the ripple effects of that brain injury, right? So you have that injury and it affects your entire life. And people don't realize that until they're living in the brain injury world, unfortunately. But, it impacts your ability to maintain your housing. It impacts your ability to maintain your job. It impacts your ability to maintain your relationships. It impacts your ability to have food on the table. It impacts all of those things. And so those are really often the things that we are at the association getting called about is, I've lost my housing, help me find housing. I've lost my job, help me, figure out how I'm going to have income. Because once you've had that brain injury event, no matter how it occurs, that impact really ripples throughout your life. So a couple things to think about when it comes to brain injury. We kind of separate out strangulation a little bit just because it is especially serious. That can cause what's called an anoxic brain injury, which is an injury related to having your brain deprived of oxygen. It's a very serious injury, and oftentimes, again, there's no outward signs that injury has occurred, and so that's particularly difficult for it to get diagnosed and for it to get treated as well. So we like to pay attention to that. And then we also want to think about the fact that oftentimes, the brain injury takes a backseat to everything else. And that means the symptoms that somebody's experiencing often take a backseat to everything else. When you are in a domestic violence situation, you're worried about your safety and you're worried about all of the things that come with that. And sometimes the fact that you have a headache or you're having difficulty remembering things really takes a back seat, or again, gets misattributed, right? I'm having difficulty remembering things and I'm having headaches just because of the trauma of the situation, and not really making the connection that is a brain injury related symptom. And so sometimes it's difficult for us in the healthcare world or the social service world to help people identify that this is a concern if we're not using proper screening tools because this may not be somebody's priority when they're discussing things with us, right? This may not be the first thing when we say, what's going on? What do you need help with? They're not worried about their headache. They're worried about where's the safe place I'm going to sleep tonight. So it's just something to keep in mind. And then to remember that brain injury is not a linear experience. And so people are going to, just like all of us, have good days and bad days. And there are certain things that make those bad days worse. And so, having fatigue, if you're not sleeping well, if you're not eating well, if you're not hydrating well, those are all going to make those brain injury symptoms worse. And so some days they're going to potentially look worse than others, and it's not necessarily going to be a consistent appearance. And that can cause some challenges for folks as well. Just because having, looking one way today and looking another way tomorrow can be confusing to providers that you may be working with and make them question what's going on. So again, we try to help folks reframe what's happening here. We lead a 6-week psychoeducational course that talks a lot about this, that folks are very commonly struggling to remember appointments, or they're, forgetting details, or they're maybe having difficulties with communication. And so there's more trouble managing their emotions after a brain injury. And these are not character flaws. This is not that they're a bad person. It's not that they're not trying. It's really a function of that brain injury. And so we really try to reframe that whole scenario to, this is a function of the injury, not the person. We want to see that it is the injury and support that person through their journey. And every journey is going to look different. Again, when you've seen one brain injury, you've seen one brain injury. It depends so much on how you were injured, where you were injured. The access to care you had is very impactful. What you were able to get access to after the injury, which in this particular setting, when we're talking about folks with domestic violence experiences, you may have been delayed access to care for your brain injury if it wasn't immediately identified as a problem. And so that can make it more challenging as well. But that's part of what our collaboration is about, is trying to educate more people so the response can be more timely. So the best way that we encourage folks to support survivors, this is really where this is the part that we do, right, at the Brain Injury Association of Ohio. And I'm speaking very specifically to Ohio, but there are affiliates just like us all across the country. And so we do encourage you to reach out to your local affiliate if you're seeking services. Services look different based on where you're at, but there are some similarities. So we pretty much all offer a helpline where you can call and get support and get guided to resources. And then there's some different variations beyond that, but we're really looking for folks to help them identify signs that they may have had a brain injury, validate the experience they're having, right? You're not crazy. This is not this is not just a mental health concern. Of course, we think, we can attribute some things to mental health related challenges after a trauma like this. But you don't need to be dismissed as just being crazy, right? Symptoms can be related to brain injury. We work to help people just simplify the steps, break things down into chunks rather than, knowing that you have to follow 50 steps to get to, your housing, because that's what you're working on. We can help people chunk it down and break it into smaller steps and help them go one step at a time so that it's much easier to manage. We work with people daily to set goals of what is it you want to do? What is the issue, that you're concerned with today that we can help you set a goal for, and then connect you to the resources to achieve that goal. And really, again, taking it one goal at a time, one step at a time, so that it's not overwhelming. Working to help folks with strategies for their memory, for managing emotions, for connecting to for connecting to individuals and their communication as well. And then, through the association, our biggest role really is in connecting to services. And so when we're setting those goals and identifying what somebody wants to do, what's the most important thing to you right now? Is it finding housing? Is it returning back to work? What does that look like? We then help with connecting to services to support achieving that goal. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, we are very strong in advocacy from the individual level all the way up to the state level, in working to help people return back to work, return back to school, and helping folks, negotiate for accommodations and helping to educate the people around them, whether that is a caregiver, a support person, general community, their employer, educating them about brain injury and how to, help facilitate that rehabilitation journey. And all of these things are really aimed at helping folks to reduce the overwhelming nature of what that experience can be like after a brain injury. So one of the things that we've done as part of our collaboration is in partnership with the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, we created a program called Empower Path. And so this was born of a program that we had launched a few years ago. In the medical community, we had heard that it took folks on average 2 to 3 years to find us. And so when we would present in the community, we would talk about our programs and services, and they would say, it took me so long to find you. If I had only known that you existed sooner, that would have really changed my rehab trajectory. I would have gotten access to care faster. It would have really helped my outcome. And so, back at that point, we partnered with medical facilities and created a backpack that offered a little bit of education in it, but also offered a connection to a support person. And so that was a consent that connected folks to our neuro resource facilitation program, which is a program that utilizes certified brain injury specialists to help people navigate systems of care after brain injury. And again, work on setting goals and connecting to resources, and helps them long-term over the course of a year or more to achieve the goals that they've set for themselves and take it step by step with them. And so we saw some great results from this project in the medical world, and we thought, well, how can we bring this to the domestic violence space? So a few months ago, we launched this Empower Path program, which is really bringing it again to that domestic violence space, where we're piloting with 2 programs, 2 different domestic violence programs in Ohio, to offer something very similar. So we're using a cosmetic bag instead of a backpack, but it again has some educational materials in it, just a small amount of educational materials, and then also a connection, a consent that would allow them to get connected to us so that we can help them navigate their brain injury journey. And again, we are not trying to become domestic violence experts. We just want to help on the brain injury side of things. And this offers us an opportunity in partnering with these sites to collaborate and to help that domestic violence partner feel like they have a solution. So, we've all talked in this collaboration about the importance of screening for brain injury. But what's that next step? So if that domestic violence shelter or program has screened for brain injury and identifies that brain injury is a concern, now what do we do with that? How do we support this person beyond that? And this program is just taking that to the next level and offering an opportunity to connect that survivor to resources that are going to specifically support them on their brain injury journey. So practical ways to support a survivor after an injury. We encourage folks to first and foremost believe them and listen without judgment. And again, going back to what I said earlier, healing isn't linear. You're going to have ups and downs, and you're going to have good days and bad days, very much dependent on everything that's happening around you. We know that our survivors do better in calm environments where, we're reducing sensory distractions, we're reducing overwhelm and stress and pressure. We encourage folks to write things down or to use their technology tools. There's tons of great technology out there to support a brain injury survivor after an injury, whether it's with their memory or emotional regulation or communication. So we offer some training on that through the association. And we really work on respecting somebody's autonomy and helping them break things down into manageable pieces. And so that's that person-centered approach I talked about. When we are reaching out to a survivor, the very first question is, what's going on and what do you need help with today? It's not about our agenda. We don't have a checklist of these are the things we want to address with you today. It's really what do you need today? And having them set their own goals. So that we can then help them achieve those goals through connection to resources.
Lauren, is it okay? I just wanted to let you know, just due to some of our time constraints, we're gonna just kind of wrap up with this piece and
Yep.
pass us over to Laura real quick.
Yep.
Um, so I think that that has been great, kind of helping us with some of those hands-on strategies in the ways in which we can continue to support survivors of abuse. And we're going to come and have our, I was gonna say our third wheel of our tricycle. I don't want you to be like a third wheel, like a good third wheel. We are a tricycle. And we want to give Laura, I'm not Laura, I'm sorry, Heather some time to really talk about forensic nursing and think about this very, very critical piece of our partnership that getting us into the healthcare. I know many of you have asked about health resources and kind of how to navigate some of those kind of things. So we are going to finish it out with Heather, our good friend Heather, who has taught us so much about the forensic nursing space.
Yes, well, thanks, Rachel, and thanks to all of you who are sharing so much in the chat. I have been able to read as the presentation's gone on, so I really appreciate you all for sharing your vulnerability and everything with us. It's really been great to read everything and connect with all of you. So I'm going to go quick through some of this, but I am kind of flipping things a little bit and going to talk more about the acute side of things that have happened or may have happened or may happen, and want to be sure you're all aware of who we are and what we do as forensic nurses, because it's so important to understand that we're available for you. And truly, every state has some version of what we do. So I wanted to share this with you. The definition is there, but we can give you the slides and we'll just go on to the next slide. I want to talk a little more about some deeper stuff as we go on. I wanted to just speak briefly about, you may have heard the term SANE nurse. That's one that's thrown around a lot. It's the sexual assault nurse examiner, and that's something that we have been called for quite some time in this practice of forensic nursing. But as you can imagine, if you're coming to the emergency room for a domestic violence case, and somebody tells you your SANE nurse is coming in, which is a sexual assault nurse examiner, it doesn't go well. It doesn't seem to match. So we are transitioning throughout the country, throughout the world, really, to be now into the role of forensic nurse examiner. As you can see there, we do all of these things now. And unfortunately, some of these things are in more than one patient. So we want to be sure that we are using that verbiage as the forensic nurse examiner when people come into the hospital. So just quickly, why are we important? I think there's so many things to understand about the role of a forensic nurse. First and foremost, we are always nurses. We provide medical care first, no matter what's going on with the patient. Their medical care is always number one, but we are there. We have specialized training. We are trauma informed, patient centered, where we learn special classes and trainings and things about the sexual assault, the violence, whatever it may be, we understand it better. When you come into our hospital and I come to see a patient, you are my only patient for as long as it takes. I will be there with you. So I think that's a huge piece. We know we've all been in the ER. I've been a patient and we know it's not like that. So we are very fortunate like that. We offer that detailed injury assessment. If you are coming in to see me in the hospital as a victim of violence, I'm going to look at every part of your body. And I don't mean that in a bad way. We just want to assess things that you may not know. You had an injury in a certain place. And I want to document that with your consent and things like that, of course, but we're going to provide detailed documentation. And additionally, if there is consent, we are going to collect evidence with your permission, of course, that may otherwise might be lost in a like regular ER setting.
Heather, could I just add a quick question? Somebody asked about how do I find one in my area? If you are interested in, like, if you need a forensic nursing, is that somewhere that's at hospitals, or how would you?
Yes,
how would you?
I can speak primarily for Ohio, but I think most places are like that. I was on a statewide meeting just a couple of days ago, and a lot of places have statewide forensic coordinators. They may call them something a little different generally through the Attorney General's office, but you can look there. You can really just call your hospitals, talk to the emergency room, and see if they have this position there. A lot of your smaller hospitals probably won't, or they may be affiliated with other hospitals. But many of the big hospitals will have people like me. Some have them full-time where they're in the hospital if they're trauma ones and things like that. If they're smaller hospitals, they may just have what we call a call team, where the person can be called in to see a person if they come in as a victim of violence. So hopefully that answers your question. I'm going to move just a little quickly here. I apologize, but some of the urgent things, coming to the ER to see us, of course, trouble breathing, loss of consciousness, strangulation, as you see there, severe pain, injury to your head, anything like that. When you're in this circumstance, we would absolutely recommend that you come in to see that. But also, if you just want some documentation, we don't have to call law enforcement unless it's a felony, and it's not always a felony. Every state's a little bit different, but sometimes we can just document, and we can document however many times you come in, but all of that documentation will be in your chart. And if you're just not sure what happened and you want us to look over your body, because sometimes you don't know, you have injuries on the back of your head and things like that. If you do want that evidence collected and do want to pursue that a little further, and if you just want to be checked out and have some support and don't know where the heck to go or what the heck to do, we can help navigate that for you. Go ahead, Rachel. Thank you. So quickly, what happens when you arrive? You're going to go through a normal triage process, but in most hospitals, you should be taken back quickly into a private room. You should not be sitting in the waiting room. Safety is first, so that is very important that you're brought back very quickly. As mentioned, you hopefully will be offered a forensic nurse, and then you can say yes or no to everything. What I love about forensics is I sit down with the patient and the patient's in charge. I will go through each and everything I'm going to do, and I will ask every step of the way, do you consent to this? Do you consent? And if halfway through you're like, I can't do anymore or whatever it is, okay, let's stop, let's talk about it and things like that. As I mentioned, the police are not automatically called. I think a lot of people are afraid to come into the hospital because of that fear of, if I call, they'll find out and things like that. We'll talk things over with you. If it is a felonious assault, we are mandated reporters. We have to, by law, have to call. But, in Ohio, that doesn't mean you have to talk to the police by any means. So we'll talk that over with you before making a phone call and stirring things up, if you will. Strangulation is a felony in Ohio. I do a lot of presentations in Ohio, so I stuck that on there, but it would just depend on your state, of course. So I wanted to mention a little bit about the role of caregivers, and I don't think we have a whole lot of time to put things in the chat, but I was wanting to think about, as a survivor, when you're coming into the hospital, there's many things that you're experiencing, right? You're overwhelmed, you're scared, you just don't even know what to do. You have your kids and your finances and, all of these things. But the caregiver's role is, to be that steady presence, that non-judgmental support, and just help with so many of the logistics. Getting to the ER, that's maybe one of the hardest things. You don't have a car. What does that look like? Childcare, of course, is where are the kids, getting the kids, transportation. How are you going to get back to wherever you go after the ER visit? And sometimes just managing all the things, right? They handed me this pile of paperwork and I've got to follow up with these people. And this is great information, but it's so overwhelming. And it's so nice to have that caregiver that can help go through those things with you and take your time. I think just being present is one of the biggest things we can do for people. Just being there, sitting with people. This is my version of, I call it sitting in the suck. And I know that's not a fancy term, but I think just sitting in it with people is huge. And for those people, focus on safety, comfort, and connection to resources. Even if you think you're not helping, just being there and going through things slowly with them, you really are helping. You can go ahead, Rachel. Quickly, what to say, I think some of these are so important, maybe just, do you feel like you can go in? We made it here to the hospital. Okay. You need to take a few minutes before we actually go in. No problem. I'm here with you. I love that. You don't have to figure it out right now. We'll just take it one step at a time. And you can go on, Rachel. I think it's important to know that we just need to focus on what can we do right now. We don't have to focus on where you're going to go and how you're going to get there and all those things. Right now, what can you do to feel safe? And that's what we focus on in the hospital. Yes, we're going to get there eventually, but it's so important just to slow things down. So I think, respect. Whoop, sorry. Can you go? Sorry, I got confused there. I was just gonna respect their decisions. Even when it's hard, they they know their situation much better than we do, and in the risks and everything like that. So even when it's hard for us, we have to respect their decision because we as the caregivers, we may be ready for action before they are, and sometimes pushing too fast and too hard may just increase the overwhelmingness that they're feeling. And again, stay with them, not ahead of them. We want to try to go and get all these things done, but that's a lot. Okay, next slide. So again, what makes you feel safest right now? Focus on that. What are you doing tonight? Are you going back to home, apartment, whatever that looks like? Do you have somewhere else to go? Safety planning, of course, is huge. That's such an important thing. We spend a lot of time as forensic nurses with safety planning, whether it's new locks and window bars and things that we give patients. We want to send you home with something. If home is the place you're going back, maybe I can give you things to at least help you feel safe. 911 cell phones and things like that. And resources, of course, we partner with ODVN and they have such outstanding resources that we could provide our patients. And I think finally, I just wanted to end with, hospital is a place for medical treatment, but it's also a place where you can go. Hopefully you can see a forensic nurse and slow things down. That's what we want to do. We want to help you get support and make a plan that feels safest for you. That's the most important thing. We're here to help support you through this process at your pace and on your terms. So I think I'll turn it back over to Rachel to finish this up.
Thank you so much. And as you can see, we have, and I would like to apologize 100% to Heather. This is our first time we have not done a training of this length for this audience at this time and, kind of timing everything out. But we appreciate, I think that we covered so much of this. I just wanted to point you out. I'm going to leave our contact information. I'm just going to throw this out here. You will get copies of, the slides that we have. And I think, again, reaching out, all of you have local resources and supports in your states, reaching out, learning about your local domestic violence programs, your local brain injury associations. As I said, learning about forensic nursing, sometimes it's hard for us because each state is a little different and how things work in each state. I know people asked about forensic exams and how they're covered, and that looks different state by state. But you do have resources through your local domestic violence programs, your statewide brain injury associations. And I think that it is, we're hoping that this was helpful in starting this conversation. Here is our contact information. If you all would like to reach out to us, I think I want to talk to the Brain Injury Association of America to see about doing some potential follow-up information because I don't think we realized how much stuff we had to talk about. But we definitely have more to talk about. So thank you all for your time today. Thank you again for everybody who shared everything in the chat. Thank you to all of you survivors. I know that, like I said, that we don't have perfect answers to all of these things, but we're starting to talk about, starting to understand these new questions, and we really appreciate all the work that you do for survivors, for brain injury survivors, for domestic and sexual violence survivors, and we look forward to talking to you again in the future. So thank you to everyone for being here.